The evacuation site was compromised. 50 wounded soldiers trapped, enemy fighters circling like vultures. Command declared the zone too dangerous for any aircraft. That's when the transport pilot stepped forward. "I've been hauling cargo through that valley for 6 months," she said quietly. "Time to haul something else." Welcome to Velvo Stories, where ordinary faces hide extraordinary pasts, and heroism speaks not in words, but actions. If you believe legends only wear uniforms, think again. The radio transmission cut through the operations tent like a blade through silence. Static, then a voice thick with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. "Mayday, mayday! This is Blackfoot 6. Grid reference 77 Alpha. 50 casualties. Position compromised. Repeat, position is compromised. Enemy fighters overhead. Cannot hold much longer." The transmission ended in static. In the tent, nobody moved for several seconds. The tactical display showed the reality in stark digital clarity. A small clearing in the Paktika Valley, surrounded by ridges that bristled with anti-aircraft positions. Intelligence reports painted the area red with hostile activity. 3 separate surface-to-air missile sites within 10 kilometers of radius. At least 4 enemy fighters conducting combat air patrol overhead. Colonel Rodriguez leaned over the communications console, his weathered face grim. "How many confirmed wounded?" 53, came the reply from the intelligence officer, plus 12 walking wounded and 15 effective still fighting. Captain Jake Morrison, the squadron's best F-16 pilot, studied the tactical display and shook his head. "Sir, that valley is a death trap. Those ridges are crawling with man-pads. Any aircraft going in there is flying into a meat grinder." "What about low-level approach?" Rodriguez asked. "Negative, sir. The valley floor is too narrow for fast movers. Too many obstacles. And with those fighters circling overhead?" Morrison's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Around the tent, other pilots exchanged glances. Some of them looked at their boots. Others stared at the map as if to will it to show them a solution that didn't exist. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. Any rescue attempt would result in more casualties than it saved. "Drones," Rodriguez asked. "Weather's turned, low ceiling, intermittent visibility. We'd be flying blind half the time." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, processing options that weren't really options at all. Then from the back of the tent, a voice spoke up. Quiet, steady, matter of fact. "I can get them out." Every head turned. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood near the rear of the tent, arms crossed, her flight suit bearing the simple patch of Air Mobility Command. Transport pilot, cargo hauler, someone who flew supply runs in medical evacuations, not combat missions. Morrison looked at her like she'd suggested they walk on water. "Sarah, that's a hot LZ. Enemy fighters, SAMs, the works. You'd be flying a defenseless transport into a shooting gallery."
Sarah stepped forward, her blue eyes fixed on the tactical display. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation ponytail that had become as much a part of her uniform as her wings. "I've been flying into that valley twice a week for 6 months. Medical supplies, ammunition resupply, casualty evacuation. I know every ridge, every thermal, every place where the wind shears." "This isn't a supply run," Rodriguez said carefully. "This is combat." "With respect, sir, they've been shooting at me for 6 months. The only difference now is they're not pretending it's an accident." The colonel studied her. Sarah Mitchell was known throughout the wing as solid, reliable, unflappable. She flew her C-130 Hercules like others drove trucks. Steady, dependable, always on time. But this was different. This was a mission that seasoned combat pilots were refusing to attempt. "Captain Mitchell, that valley is currently occupied by at least 4 enemy fighters. Your aircraft has no defensive capabilities, no weapon systems." "Sir," Sarah interrupted quietly, "with your permission, I'd like to show you something." She moved to the tactical display and began tracing routes with her finger. "The enemy fighters are maintaining a patrol pattern at 15,000 feet. The valley floor is at 8,000. If I come in from the south, using the ridgeline for cover, I can drop down to 500 feet above the deck before they even know I'm there." "And then what?" Morrison asked. "Even if you make it to the LZ, how do you get out? Those fighters will be all over you." Sarah smiled for the first time that evening. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the expression of someone who knew something others didn't. Let me worry about that part. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. In his 25 years of military service, he had learned to recognize certain qualities in people. Courage was common enough in the military. Competence was expected. But there was something else, something rarer, the combination of capability and certainty that marked those who could do impossible things when circumstances demanded it. "What do you need?" he asked. Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Access to the weapons bay and about 30 minutes with the armament crew." "Captain Mitchell, the C-130 isn't designed for—" "Sir, with respect, the C-130 can be modified to carry almost anything, including things most people don't expect a transport aircraft to carry." 25 minutes later, Sarah stood in Hangar Bay 7, watching as her crew chief, Master Sergeant Williams, supervised the installation of equipment that officially didn't exist on her aircraft. "Ma'am, I've been working on Hercs for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this configuration." Sarah ran her hand along the external mounting points that had been installed beneath her aircraft's wings. To most observers, they looked like standard cargo pods, but these pods contained something very different from medical supplies or ammunition.
The manufacturer called it a special mission package, she said, designed for unconventional operations in permissive environments. Williams raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, that valley doesn't sound very permissive. It will be by the time I'm done with it." Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began her pre-flight checks. The C-130 Hercules was a beast. 4 turboprop engines, massive cargo capacity, designed to land on rough airstrips and operate in conditions that would ground more sophisticated aircraft. But today, her Hercules was carrying modifications that would have surprised its designers. As she ran through her checklist, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. She had started her military career as a fighter pilot, flying F-16s out of Ramstein Air Base in Germany. She'd been good, very good. But a training accident that left her with permanent damage to her inner ear had ended her fighter career before it really began. The damage wasn't severe enough to ground her completely, but it was enough to disqualify her from high-G combat maneuvering. Instead of leaving the military, Sarah transferred to Air Mobility Command. If she couldn't fly fighters, she would fly transports. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was flying, and it was service. Over the years, she had developed a reputation for being able to land anywhere, carry anything, and complete missions that other pilots considered impossible. What her fellow pilots didn't know was that Sarah had never stopped thinking like a fighter pilot. Every supply run was a tactical exercise. Every landing was a combat approach. Every flight through potentially hostile airspace was an opportunity to study enemy patterns and develop countermeasures. And for the past 6 months, flying regular missions into the Paktika Valley, she had been planning for a day exactly like today. The memories flooded back as she continued her pre-flight routine. There was the first mission, 3 months into her deployment, when she'd noticed the unusual radio chatter patterns that suggested enemy coordination. The second mission, when she'd spotted the glint of metal from a ridge that intelligence had marked as clear. The third mission, when she'd seen the dust clouds that indicated vehicle movement along a supposedly abandoned road. Each flight had been a piece of a larger puzzle. Each observation had been cataloged, analyzed, stored away for future reference. While other pilots saw routine supply runs, Sarah saw intelligence-gathering opportunities. While others flew by the book, Sarah had been writing her own tactical manual. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her inner ear damage, the very thing that ended her fighter career, had actually made her a better transport pilot. The condition that prevented her from handling high-G maneuvers had forced her to develop alternative approaches to aerial combat. She couldn't dogfight in the traditional sense, but she could think, plan, and execute with a precision that most fighter pilots never achieved. Tower, this is Thunder 47, requesting immediate departure, Vector 270.
Thunder 47, you are cleared for takeoff. Weather advisory, low ceiling at destination, visibility 2 miles in haze. Copy weather advisory, Thunder 47 rolling. Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Allison T-56 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the massive aircraft began its takeoff roll. As the Hercules lifted into the afternoon sky, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the beginning of any mission. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't carrying cargo. She was carrying something much more dangerous. The flight to the Paktika Valley took 47 minutes. Sarah flew at medium altitude initially, following standard transport corridors, maintaining radio contact with air traffic control. To anyone monitoring her progress, she appeared to be conducting a routine supply run. But as she approached the target area, Sarah began her descent, not the gradual, controlled descent of a transport aircraft approaching a normal landing, but the aggressive dive of a fighter pilot who knew exactly where she was going and didn't want to give anyone time to react. At 20 miles from the landing zone, Sarah dropped to 500 feet above the terrain. The Hercules thundered over ridgelines and down valleys, its massive bulk somehow moving with the precision of a much smaller aircraft. Sarah flew by visual reference, using landmarks she had memorized over months of previous flights. The landscape below told its own story. She could see the burned-out remains of a convoy that had been ambushed 2 weeks earlier, the blackened circle where a helicopter had been forced down by ground fire, the spiderweb of trails that connected enemy positions throughout the region. All of it was intelligence that she had gathered during her supposedly routine cargo runs. Her radio crackled. "Guardian Base, you are flying outside established corridors. State your intentions." Sarah didn't respond. She was now flying below radar coverage, using the terrain to mask her approach. On her tactical display, she could see the enemy fighters circling overhead, maintaining their patrol pattern at 15,000 feet. They had no idea she was coming. At 10 miles from the landing zone, Sarah began her final approach preparation. She didn't slow down. Instead, she descended further, dropping to less than 200 feet above the valley floor. The Hercules flew between ridgelines that rose on either side like canyon walls. The altimeter readings were insane by any normal standard. No transport pilot in their right mind would fly this low, this fast, in hostile territory. But Sarah wasn't a normal transport pilot. She was a fighter pilot who happened to be flying a cargo plane, and she was about to prove that the distinction was meaningless. And then she saw them. The enemy fighters were exactly where her intelligence had indicated they would be, circling lazily overhead like vultures waiting for carrion. 4 aircraft, flying in a loose formation, clearly confident that they controlled the airspace completely.
Sarah keyed her radio to the emergency frequency. "Blackfoot 6, this is Thunder 47. Cavalry's coming. Keep your heads down." She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she activated the systems that officially didn't exist on her aircraft. The weapons bay doors opened beneath the Hercules fuselage, but instead of deploying cargo or paratroopers, they revealed something that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew what transport aircraft were capable of. Sarah pulled back on the stick, trading airspeed for altitude, in a maneuver that pushed the Hercules to the limits of its design envelope. As the massive aircraft climbed, she armed the systems that had been installed in those innocent-looking cargo pods beneath her wings. The first enemy fighter pilot spotted her climb and began to turn toward her, probably thinking he was looking at a lost transport plane that had wandered into the wrong airspace. He was still turning when Sarah's first air-to-air missile found him.
The AIM-120 AMRAAM streaked away from the Hercules wing-mounted launcher with a trail of white smoke. The enemy pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to realize that the lumbering transport aircraft was actually a predator before his fighter exploded in a fireball that lit up the valley. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. Pieces of aircraft rained down on the ridgelines below, and the shockwave rattled windows in villages miles away. But Sarah didn't pause to admire her handiwork. She was already lining up her next shot. The other 3 fighters reacted immediately, breaking formation and beginning evasive maneuvers. But Sarah had expected that. She had studied their tactics for months, had watched them operate, had learned their patterns. The second missile launched before the first explosion had even faded. Another enemy fighter disappeared in a burst of flame and debris. Now the remaining fighters knew they were in a fight, but they couldn't understand what they were fighting. The massive transport aircraft was maneuvering like a fighter, attacking with the precision of a combat pilot, but it was impossible. Transport planes didn't carry air-to-air missiles. Transport pilots didn't engage in aerial combat. The third enemy fighter attempted to close for a guns attack, probably figuring that whatever modifications had been made to the Hercules, it couldn't possibly outmaneuver a dedicated fighter aircraft. He was wrong. Sarah threw the Hercules into a turn that stressed the airframe to its limits. The massive aircraft responded like a dancer, using its size and momentum to create angles that the smaller aircraft couldn't match. As the enemy pilot tried to line up a shot, Sarah was already positioning for her next attack. The maneuver was something she had developed during her months of study and planning. The Hercules might not be able to turn as tightly as a fighter, but it could use its mass and power to create momentum that smaller aircraft couldn't overcome. It was physics applied to aerial combat, and it worked perfectly.
The third missile launch was almost casual. Sarah barely had to adjust her heading before the weapon found its target and erased another enemy fighter from the sky. The fourth and final enemy pilot apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He turned away from the valley and began to climb, probably hoping to escape before the impossible transport aircraft could target him as well. Sarah let him go. She had other priorities, and besides, one survivor would spread the word. The next time enemy fighters encountered a C-130, they might think twice before assuming it was helpless. She nosed the Hercules downward toward the landing zone where 53 wounded soldiers were waiting for evacuation. The enemy air cover was gone, but the anti-aircraft positions in the surrounding ridges were still active. She could see muzzle flashes from several locations as ground-based weapons tried to target her aircraft. Sarah smiled grimly and activated the second set of systems that had been installed on her aircraft. The cargo bay doors opened fully, and a different kind of weapon emerged. Not missiles this time, but precision-guided bombs that had been adapted for deployment from transport aircraft. The modification was experimental, theoretically possible, but never tested in actual combat. Sarah was about to provide the first field test. She flew a precise pattern over the ridgelines, dropping ordnance with surgical accuracy on the anti-aircraft positions that had harassed friendly forces for weeks. Each explosion eliminated a threat that had made the valley too dangerous for normal operations. The bombing run was a work of art. Sarah had spent months studying these positions, noting their fields of fire, their blind spots, their patterns of operation. Now she put that knowledge to use, striking each position with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Within minutes, the ridgelines that had bristled with enemy weapons were silent and smoking. Sarah keyed her radio. "Blackfoot 6, this is Thunder 47. The neighborhood's been cleaned up. Prepare for immediate evacuation." She lined up for her landing approach, configuring the Hercules for its intended mission, carrying passengers out of harm's way. The massive aircraft touched down on the improvised landing zone with the gentleness of a bird landing on water. As the cargo ramp lowered, medical personnel and walking wounded began loading the casualties. Sarah kept her engines running, ready for immediate departure if necessary. But the valley was now quiet. The circling vultures were gone,
and the threats that had made evacuation impossible had been eliminated. The loading process was swift and efficient. The wounded were secured in stretchers. The walking wounded found seats along the cargo bay walls, and the remaining effective personnel took positions near the exits. Everyone moved with the urgency of people who knew they were still in danger, despite the sudden quiet.
In 18 minutes, all 53 casualties were aboard, along with the remaining effective personnel. Sarah raised the cargo ramp and began her takeoff roll without ceremony. As the Hercules climbed away from the valley, Sarah looked back at the smoking ridgelines and the debris field where 4 enemy fighters had once patrolled. The mission was complete, but she knew the real work was just beginning. Back at base, there would be questions. Lots of questions. About her aircraft's modifications, about her tactics, about how a transport pilot had managed to single-handedly clear an enemy-controlled valley that combat squadrons had declared too dangerous to approach. Sarah didn't mind the questions. She had answers for all of them. But first, she had 53 wounded soldiers to deliver to medical care. Everything else could wait. The landing at Kandahar airfield drew a crowd. Word had spread quickly through the communications networks that something unprecedented had happened in the Paktika Valley. By the time Sarah's Hercules touched down, half the base seemed to be gathered along the flight line. Medical vehicles waited near the cargo ramp as the massive aircraft rolled to a stop. But before the wounded could be unloaded, Sarah found herself surrounded by a different kind of reception committee. Colonel Rodriguez was there, along with several other officers she didn't recognize. Their expressions ranged from amazement to suspicion to something that might have been awe. Sarah shut down her engines and completed her post-flight checklist with the same methodical precision she brought to every mission. Only when she was satisfied that her aircraft was properly secured did she open the cockpit door and climb down to face the crowd. "Captain Mitchell, I need to debrief you immediately." "Yes, sir. As soon as the casualties are offloaded and en route to medical care." Rodriguez nodded. The wounded took priority over everything else, including his burning curiosity about how a transport pilot had just accomplished what an entire fighter squadron had deemed impossible. It took 20 minutes to unload all the casualties and transfer them to the medical facility. Sarah supervised the process personally, checking with the medical personnel to ensure that the most critical cases received immediate attention. Only when the last stretcher was loaded into an ambulance did she turn to face the gathering of officers who had been waiting with barely controlled impatience. "Colonel Rodriguez, ready for debrief, sir." "My office. Now." The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Sarah answered every question with the same calm precision she shown during the mission itself. Yes, her aircraft had been modified with special mission equipment. Yes, she had engaged and destroyed 4 enemy fighters. Yes, she had eliminated multiple ground-based threats using precision-guided munitions. The modifications to her aircraft were part of an experimental program she had volunteered for months earlier. The weapon systems were designed to provide transport aircraft with limited self-defense capability in hostile environments. Today had been the first operational test of the system.
"And you didn't think to inform command of these capabilities?" asked a lieutenant colonel she didn't recognize. "Sir, the program is classified above my clearance level. I was instructed to use the systems only in extremist situations where no other options existed. And you determined that this qualified as such a situation." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Sir, 53 wounded soldiers were going to perish if someone didn't extract them. No other aircraft was available or capable of completing the mission. I used the resources at my disposal to save American lives." The questions continued for hours. Every aspect of the mission was dissected, analyzed, and documented. Sarah's tactical decisions were scrutinized by combat veterans who couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. The idea that a transport pilot, a cargo hauler, had single-handedly cleared a valley that an entire fighter squadron had declared too dangerous to approach challenged everything they thought they knew about air combat. Later, when the formal debrief was complete and the reports had been filed, Colonel Rodriguez found Sarah in the crew lounge, quietly drinking coffee and reading a maintenance manual. "Off the record," he said, sitting down across from her.
Where do you learn to fly like that? Sarah looked up from her manual. Sir? That wasn't transport pilot flying. That was fighter pilot maneuvering in a 100-ton aircraft. Where did you train for air-to-air combat? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, F-16, sir. Rammstein, 2019-2020. Medical disqualification ended my fighter career. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. Inner ear damage. Yes, sir. Couldn't handle high G maneuvering anymore, but there's nothing wrong with my ability to think tactically or fly precision approaches. And the weapons systems, the modified aircraft. Sarah smiled slightly. Sir, there are a lot of experimental programs in the Air Force. Some of them are designed to give transport aircraft capabilities that most people don't expect them to have. And you volunteered for this program because someone needs to be ready when the impossible mission comes up. Today proved that sometimes the cavalry rides in a cargo plane. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, processing everything he had witnessed and learned. Finally, he said, Captain Mitchell, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did today was extraordinary. Sarah shook her head. No, sir. I was just doing my job. Getting people home safely is what transport pilots do. Not like that, they don't. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at attention in a ceremony that had drawn representatives from throughout Air Mobility Command. The medal was pinned to her uniform by a 2-star general who had flown in specifically for the event. But the ceremony was just the beginning. Within days of the mission, Sarah found herself reassigned to a new unit, one that officially didn't exist, and worked on projects that officially didn't happen.
Her new squadron flew aircraft that looked like transports, but carried capabilities that would have surprised most people who thought they understood military aviation. The missions were classified, the destinations were often denied, and the work was exactly what Sarah had been training for, without knowing it. The wounded soldiers she had evacuated from the Paktika Valley all recovered. Several of them wrote letters thanking her for her actions that day. One of them, a young sergeant who had been badly wounded in the initial ambush, wrote, Ma'am, I want you to know that when we heard your engines overhead, it was like hearing the voice of God. We knew we were going home. Sarah kept that letter in her flight bag, along with the others she received. They reminded her why she flew, why she served, and why some missions were worth any risk. But perhaps the most significant outcome of that day wasn't the medal, or the reassignment, or even the lives saved. It was the change in how the Air Force thought about transport aircraft and the pilots who flew them. The mission sparked a classified program to develop enhanced defensive capabilities for cargo aircraft operating in hostile environments. Sarah became one of the primary test pilots for the program, helping to develop tactics and procedures that would protect future transport missions. Her techniques were studied, analyzed, and eventually incorporated into training programs for transport pilots throughout the military. The idea that cargo aircraft could serve as platforms for precision strikes and air-to-air combat was no longer theoretical. The program expanded to include other aircraft types and mission profiles. Transport helicopters began carrying defensive systems. Aerial refueling tankers were equipped with countermeasures. The line between combat and support aircraft became increasingly blurred. Sarah became an instructor pilot, teaching other transport pilots how to think tactically, how to use their aircraft's size and capabilities to their advantage, and how to complete missions that others considered impossible. She never flew another mission exactly like the one in the Paktika Valley, but she didn't need to. That single flight had demonstrated something that changed military aviation forever. That with the right pilot, the right modifications, and the right circumstances, any aircraft could become a weapon. Years later, when Sarah had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was commanding her own squadron of special operations transport aircraft, she would tell new pilots, Don't let anyone tell you what your aircraft can't do. The only limitations are the ones you accept. The transport pilot who had stepped forward when combat pilots refused the mission became a legend in military aviation circles. But Sarah never forgot the lesson of that day. Sometimes the most important thing you can carry isn't cargo or passengers. Sometimes the most important thing you can carry is the willingness to do what others won't when lives depend on it.
The valley where it all happened was eventually secured by ground forces, who found the wreckage of 4 enemy fighters scattered across the ridgelines. Local intelligence sources later reported that the enemy had abandoned their positions in that sector entirely, believing that American forces possessed some kind of new superweapon. In a way, they were right. The superweapon was a transport pilot who refused to accept that a mission was impossible, and the understanding that in the right hands, any aircraft could become exactly what the situation demanded. The cavalry had indeed arrived in a cargo plane, and military aviation would never be quite the same.